She thought she was walking into an ordinary school meeting, but the people who laughed at her had no idea they were only seconds away from regretting it. Oak Ridge Academy stood proudly on a hill overlooking the town, its red brick buildings glowing beneath the soft light of a cool autumn morning. Luxury vehicles filled the parking lot. Parents dressed in expensive coats and tailored business attire moved toward the main auditorium, exchanging polite greetings and conversations about investments, careers, and college admissions. It was the kind of place where success was often visible before a person ever spoke. At exactly 9:14 that morning, Sarah Mitchell stepped through the front gates carrying a simple canvas handbag. At 42 years old, Sarah looked nothing like the parents surrounding her. She wore a faded beige cardigan over a plain white blouse, dark blue jeans, and comfortable shoes that had clearly been chosen for practicality rather than appearance. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail. There was nothing flashy about her, nothing designed to attract attention. And yet, before the morning was over, she would become the most important person in the building. Sarah walked calmly across the courtyard, passing groups of parents gathered near the entrance. Some barely noticed her. Others glanced at her briefly before returning to their conversations. The Academy was hosting its annual Founders Celebration, one of the most prestigious events of the school year. Influential donors, community leaders, and distinguished guests had been invited to attend. Inside the auditorium, staff members hurried between rows of reserved seats, while volunteers arranged programs and refreshments. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Sarah quietly entered the building and checked the invitation she had folded inside her handbag. She smiled softly and continued toward the main hall. Across the lobby stood Vice Principal Linda Parker. At 48, Linda carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. Her tailored navy suit, polished shoes, and perfectly arranged appearance reflected years of professional success. She greeted arriving guests with practiced warmth, carefully recognizing influential parents and major donors. To Linda, appearances often provided a quick shortcut to understanding people. It was a habit she rarely questioned. As she welcomed another family into the auditorium, her eyes drifted toward Sarah. The contrast was immediate. Linda noticed the simple clothing, the inexpensive handbag, the absence of any visible signs of status. A subtle frown appeared on her face. Sarah, unaware of the attention, continued walking toward the registration table. Linda watched her for several seconds. Something about Sarah seemed out of place among the distinguished guests arriving that morning. The assumption formed quickly. Perhaps she was a volunteer. Perhaps she was accompanying someone else. Whatever the explanation, Linda felt certain Sarah could not possibly be one of the event's important attendees. Sarah approached the registration desk and quietly thanked a student volunteer who handed her a program. Her voice was warm and kind. The student smiled back. Then Sarah turned toward the reserved seating area near the front of the auditorium. Linda immediately noticed. Her expression tightened slightly. Nearby parents followed Sarah with curious eyes as she moved toward some of the most prominent seats in the room. The stage lights glowed above a large banner celebrating academic excellence and community leadership. Rows of chairs filled with influential guests stretched across the hall. Sarah reached an empty seat near the front and sat down comfortably, placing her handbag beside her chair. Several people nearby exchanged puzzled looks. Linda watched from across the room. A decision was already forming in her mind. She straightened her jacket and began walking towards Sarah. Around them, conversations continued and laughter echoed softly through the auditorium. No one realized they were only moments away from witnessing a lesson about dignity that Oak Ridge Academy would remember for years. Vice Principal Linda Parker crossed the auditorium with measured confidence, her polished shoes clicking softly against the floor as she approached the front row. Around her, parents continued settling into their seats, while quiet conversations drifted through the room. Sarah Mitchell sat calmly near the front of the auditorium, reading through the event program she had received at the registration table. She seemed completely at ease. Linda stopped beside her chair and offered a professional smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said. Sarah looked up and returned the smile. "Good morning." Linda glanced at the reserved seating sign attached to the row. "May I see your invitation?" The question sounded polite enough, but several nearby parents immediately turned their attention toward the exchange. Sarah nodded and reached into her handbag. She handed over the invitation without hesitation. Linda examined it briefly. The invitation was genuine. That should have ended the conversation. Instead, she continued searching for an explanation that fit the assumptions already established in her mind. "And who invited you?" she asked. Sarah appeared slightly surprised by the question. "The school did." Linda forced a small laugh. "Of course. What I mean is which department." Sarah remained calm. "I am not sure. The invitation came directly from the academy." A few parents nearby exchanged curious glances. Linda felt herself becoming increasingly convinced that something was unusual. The prestigious Founders Celebration was attended by major donors, school board members, and distinguished guests. Sarah simply did not fit the image Linda expected. She looked around at the elegantly dressed attendees occupying the surrounding seats. Then she looked back at Sarah. "These seats are generally reserved for special guests," Linda explained. "Perhaps there has been some confusion." Sarah blinked. "Confusion?" "Yes." Linda pointed toward several empty rows farther back. "There are plenty of comfortable seats available there." The implication was obvious. Sarah followed Linda's gesture and then looked back toward her. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The silence attracted even more attention from nearby attendees. Sarah's expression remained composed. "This is the seat listed on my invitation," she said gently. Linda smiled again, though this time the warmth was completely gone. "I understand. However, these front seats are intended for honored guests and distinguished visitors." Several people seated nearby overheard the comment. One man lowered his program. Another parent glanced openly at Sarah's clothing. The atmosphere began to shift. Sarah noticed it immediately. She recognized the familiar pattern. People deciding who belonged before learning anything about them. Still, she remained calm. "If there has been a mistake, I am happy to cooperate," she said. Her kindness only seemed to strengthen Linda's confidence. In Linda's mind, Sarah's willingness to move confirmed that she did not belong there. "Thank you," Linda replied. "I appreciate your understanding." A few nearby parents nodded approvingly. One woman whispered something to her husband and smiled. Sarah slowly gathered her belongings and stood. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply picked up her canvas handbag and prepared to move. The ease with which she accepted the situation puzzled a few people watching. Most expected embarrassment. Others expected resistance. Instead, Sarah remained remarkably peaceful. As she stepped away from the front row, several attendees resumed their conversations, believing the matter settled. Linda felt satisfied that she had restored order. Yet something about Sarah's calmness lingered in the air. It was not the calmness of someone defeated. It was the calmness of someone who knew something everyone else did not. And as Sarah quietly walked toward the back section of the auditorium, the first signs of doubt began appearing in the minds of a few people who had witnessed the exchange. Sarah Mitchell quietly walked toward the back section of the auditorium, her canvas handbag resting against her side as conversations resumed around her. Most people seemed satisfied that the situation had been resolved. A few parents returned to discussing business ventures and college applications. Others glanced briefly toward Sarah before losing interest altogether. Yet not everyone felt comfortable. Several attendees who had witnessed the exchange found themselves replaying it in their minds. There had been something unsettling about the way Sarah had been treated. Not because she argued. Quite the opposite. Her calm dignity made the moment feel worse. She eventually reached an empty seat near the rear of the auditorium and sat down. Sunlight filtered through tall windows along the side walls, casting soft patterns across the polished floor. Sarah opened the event program and began reading as though nothing unusual had happened. There was no anger on her face. No embarrassment, no visible frustration. She simply turned the pages quietly. Near the front of the room, Vice Principal Linda Parker continued greeting guests. The incident already felt finished in her mind. She had protected the seating arrangement. She had maintained the academy standards. At least that was how she justified it. Several parents complimented her professionalism. One school board member nodded approvingly as she passed. The validation reinforced her confidence. Meanwhile, the auditorium continued filling with distinguished guests. School administrators moved between rows. Volunteers distributed refreshments. Soft music played through overhead speakers while families settled into their seats. The annual celebration would begin in only a few minutes. Then something unusual happened. A young student volunteer approached the registration table carrying a clipboard. He appeared nervous. After speaking briefly with another staff member, he looked around the room repeatedly. His eyes eventually found Linda. He hurried across the auditorium and handed her a sheet of paper. Linda glanced at it casually. Then she frowned. She read it again. The student pointed toward the stage before quickly returning to his duties. Linda stared at the paper for several seconds. Her expression changed slightly. It was not panic. Not yet. More confusion than anything else. Across the room, Sarah remained seated quietly in the back row. She seemed completely detached from the growing activity near the front. A few parents noticed Linda speaking urgently with another administrator. The conversation lasted only a moment before the administrator rushed away. Whispers began spreading through nearby seats. Nobody knew what was happening. On stage, several faculty members gathered near the curtain. One checked his watch repeatedly. Another appeared to be searching the audience. The atmosphere shifted subtly. The event was still on schedule, yet something no longer felt routine. Sarah looked up briefly from her program. She noticed the movement near the stage but returned her attention to the booklet without concern. Her composure remained remarkable. A woman seated nearby finally spoke to her. "You seem very calm." Sarah smiled politely. "It is a nice morning." The woman laughed softly. "After what happened earlier, I would not be nearly as relaxed." Sarah folded her hands over the program. People are often quick to make assumptions. There is not much value in becoming upset about it. The answer lingered in the woman's mind. Before she could respond, a sudden burst of activity near the auditorium entrance drew everyone's attention. Several administrators had appeared in the lobby. Among them was Principal Robert Henderson himself. The principal rarely attended events this early. Yet there he was, moving quickly through the entrance with an expression of urgency. The conversations throughout the auditorium began fading. Heads turned. Eyes followed him as he entered. Principal Henderson scanned the room once, then a second time. It was immediately obvious that he was searching for someone. And within seconds, every person in the auditorium would discover exactly who that someone was. Principal Robert Henderson moved quickly down the center aisle of the auditorium, his polished shoes crossing the floor with unusual urgency. Conversations faded one by one as people noticed the expression on his face. This was not the relaxed demeanor parents expected from a school administrator preparing for a celebration. He looked concerned, focused, determined to find someone. Hundreds of eyes followed him as he scanned the room. Vice Principal Linda Parker stepped forward immediately. "Robert," she said quietly, "is everything all right?" The principal barely slowed. "Have you seen Sarah Mitchell?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Linda blinked. "Sarah Mitchell?" "Yes." His eyes continued searching the audience. "She arrived this morning." For the first time, uncertainty appeared on Linda's face. Around them, several parents exchanged curious glances. The name meant nothing to most people. Yet the urgency in the principal's voice suggested it should. Linda hesitated. "I spoke with her earlier." Robert immediately turned toward her. "Good. Where is she?" Linda pointed toward the rear section of the auditorium. "She moved to the back." The principal's expression changed instantly. "She moved." Linda felt a small knot forming in her stomach. There was some confusion regarding seating. Robert stared at her for a second longer than was comfortable. Then he looked toward the back rows. His eyes immediately found Sarah. Relief washed across his face. Without another word, he began walking toward her. The entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath. Sarah looked up from her program as the principal approached. A warm smile appeared on his face. "Mrs. Mitchell." Sarah stood politely. "Good morning, Robert." The familiarity between them immediately caught the attention of everyone nearby. Robert extended both hands and shook hers warmly. "I have been looking everywhere for you." Sarah smiled. "I am sorry if I caused any trouble." "Trouble?" Robert laughed softly. "You are the most important guest here today." The words echoed far beyond their conversation. People seated nearby heard them first, then others. A ripple of whispers spread across the auditorium. Linda stood frozen near the front. Robert continued speaking. "We were preparing to begin and realized our guest of honor was not in the reserved section." Sarah glanced toward the front rows. Understanding immediately crossed her face. "I see." Robert looked genuinely concerned. "Did someone move you?" Sarah hesitated briefly. She could have answered in many different ways. Instead, she chose kindness. "I believe there was simply a misunderstanding." The grace of the response made several nearby attendees lower their eyes. Robert nodded. "Well, we need to fix that immediately." He gestured toward the stage. "Everyone has been waiting for you." The auditorium had become almost completely silent. Parents who had ignored Sarah earlier now stared openly. Others remembered the exchange with Linda and felt a growing discomfort. The woman who had quietly accepted public embarrassment was apparently someone the principal considered essential to the event. Robert smiled warmly. "Would you please join me at the front?" Sarah picked up her canvas handbag. "Of course." As they began walking down the aisle together, conversations disappeared entirely. Hundreds of people watched in silence. Linda remained standing where she was, unable to look away. The confidence she had carried all morning was beginning to crumble. She still did not know who Sarah Mitchell truly was. But one thing had become painfully clear. The woman she had dismissed in front of everyone was not supposed to be sitting in the back row. And within moments, the entire academy was about to discover why. The auditorium remained silent as Principal Robert Henderson escorted Sarah Mitchell toward the front of the room. Every step seemed to draw more attention. Parents who had barely noticed her earlier now watched with open curiosity. School board members exchanged confused looks. Faculty members standing near the stage appeared relieved to see her. Sarah herself remained calm, carrying the same canvas handbag and wearing the same modest cardigan that had led so many people to underestimate her only minutes before. Robert guided her to the front row, then personally pulled out a reserved chair positioned directly beside the stage. A small gold nameplate rested on the seat. The moment Sarah sat down, several nearby attendees leaned forward to read it. Their expressions changed instantly. The whispers began almost immediately. Linda Parker remained standing near the aisle, unable to ignore the growing sense of unease settling over her. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She watched as Robert stepped onto the stage and adjusted the microphone. The room slowly settled. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him. He smiled warmly. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Oak Ridge Academy's annual Founders Celebration." Polite applause filled the hall. Robert waited for it to fade. "Every year, we gather to celebrate the people who help make opportunities possible for our students." More nods followed. Most attendees expected another speech about academic achievement and community partnerships. Instead, Robert glanced toward Sarah. His smile widened. "This year is particularly special." The room grew quieter. For the first time in many years, the individual responsible for our largest scholarship initiative has agreed to attend in person. Confused expressions spread through the audience. Several school board members sat straighter. Parents exchanged curious glances. Robert continued. "Over the last decade, this individual has funded educational opportunities for hundreds of students who otherwise could not have attended Oak Ridge Academy." A murmur swept across the room. Everyone knew about the scholarship program. It was one of the most respected initiatives in the region. Yet very few people knew who funded it. The donor had always chosen complete privacy. Robert looked toward Sarah once more. Many of our students have gone on to attend top universities because of her generosity. The room had become completely silent. Linda felt her heartbeat quicken. Suddenly she remembered the reserved seat, the invitation, the urgency with which Robert had searched for Sarah. A terrible realization began forming in her mind. Robert extended his hand toward the front row. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the founder and sole benefactor of the Mitchell Scholars Foundation, Mrs. Sarah Mitchell. For a moment, nobody moved. The audience seemed unable to process what they had just heard. Then heads turned toward Sarah all at once. Gasps echoed across the auditorium. Several people visibly froze. One parent lowered her program in disbelief. Another looked toward Linda and then quickly looked away. Sarah stood slowly as applause began spreading through the room. It started with a few faculty members. Then school board members joined. Within seconds, the entire auditorium erupted into applause. Sarah smiled politely but appeared almost embarrassed by the attention. She offered a small wave before sitting down again. Linda felt her stomach drop. The woman she had publicly removed from the honored guest section was not merely an invited attendee. She was the reason many students in the room had been given a future. Around her, parents whispered in shock. And as the applause continued echoing beneath the auditorium ceiling, Linda realized that the worst part was not what everyone else now knew. It was the fact that Sarah had known it the entire time and had never once used it to defend herself. The applause continued for several moments before gradually fading into a mixture of admiration, surprise, and quiet reflection. Sarah Mitchell returned to her seat near the stage, her expression unchanged despite the attention surrounding her. The same calm dignity remained on her face. She neither celebrated the recognition nor appeared interested in the status that came with it. To many people in the auditorium, that was becoming the most remarkable detail of all. Principal Robert Henderson remained at the podium and waited for the room to settle. Once the final applause faded, he smiled toward Sarah once more. Many of our students would not be sitting in these classrooms today without her generosity. Heads throughout the auditorium nodded. Several scholarship recipients seated with their families looked toward Sarah with gratitude. Some parents quietly wiped tears from their eyes. The impact of her contributions was suddenly becoming visible. Robert continued, "What makes her support extraordinary is that she never requested publicity, recognition, or naming rights." A few school board members smiled knowingly. In fact, for years she specifically asked us not to reveal her identity. The audience reacted with another wave of astonishment. In a world where many people attached their names to every donation, Sarah had chosen anonymity. Linda Parker listened from the side of the auditorium. Each new detail made her earlier actions feel worse. She replayed the conversation over and over in her mind. The invitation, the seating assignment, the assumptions, the polite way Sarah had accepted public embarrassment without mentioning who she was. Linda felt heat rising in her face. Around her, several parents who had witnessed the incident earlier now understood exactly what had happened. The glances she received were impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Robert invited Sarah onto the stage. The audience applauded once more as she approached the podium. The large auditorium fell silent as she stood before them. For a moment, she simply looked out across the crowd. Hundreds of people stared back. Students, teachers, parents, administrators. Many expected a speech celebrating her accomplishments. Others expected her to finally explain why she had chosen to support the school. Instead, her words surprised everyone. "I am grateful to be here," she began softly. Her voice carried easily through the hall. "But I hope today remains focused on the students." The audience listened carefully. Sarah smiled. "The scholarships were never about me. They were about opportunity." A hush settled across the room. "Many years ago, someone gave me a chance when I needed one. Everything I have done since then has been my way of passing that chance forward." The simplicity of the statement carried enormous weight. No grand speech, no dramatic story, just gratitude, Sarah continued. There are talented young people everywhere. Sometimes all they need is one person willing to believe in them. Several teachers exchanged emotional looks. Parents nodded quietly. The message felt deeply personal. Then Sarah stepped away from the microphone. The entire speech had lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet somehow it felt more powerful than anything else spoken that morning. The audience rose into another standing ovation. This time it was not because of her donations. It was because of her character. As applause filled the room, Sarah returned to her seat. She looked relieved to leave the spotlight behind. Across the auditorium, Linda lowered her eyes. The contrast had become impossible to escape. The woman she had judged by appearance possessed more humility than anyone else in the building. And for the first time that morning, Linda understood that the real lesson unfolding at Oak Ridge Academy had nothing to do with money, status, or influence. It had everything to do with the quiet dignity of a person who never needed those things to prove her worth. The standing ovation gradually faded, but the emotional weight inside the auditorium remained. People returned to their seats carrying a new perspective on the woman they had overlooked only an hour earlier. Yet for Vice Principal Linda Parker, the applause felt less like celebration and more like a reminder. Every kind word spoken about Sarah Mitchell seemed to echo against the memory of their earlier encounter. Linda remained near the side of the auditorium, watching as students approached Sarah during a short intermission. One by one, they thanked her. Some spoke about scholarships that had changed their lives. Others introduced family members who had benefited from opportunities made possible through her generosity. Sarah listened to each person with genuine attention. She smiled, asked questions, and remembered details about people she had never publicly met. There was no distance between her and the students. No trace of superiority. The more Linda watched, the worse she felt. Eventually, Principal Robert Henderson stepped away to speak with several board members, leaving Sarah standing alone near the stage. Linda knew she should say something. The opportunity was there, yet her feet felt strangely heavy. She had spent years teaching students about respect, character, and integrity. Now she found herself struggling to demonstrate those same values. Across the auditorium, Sarah noticed Linda standing by herself. To Linda's surprise, Sarah offered a small, friendly smile. There was no resentment in it, no accusation. That somehow made everything harder. A few nearby parents noticed the exchange. The atmosphere grew noticeably quiet. Many of them had witnessed what happened earlier. Some were waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Linda finally took a breath and walked toward Sarah. Every step seemed to attract attention. Conversations softened. Eyes followed her movement. When she reached Sarah, she stopped for a moment before speaking. "Mrs. Mitchell." Sarah turned toward her. "Yes." Linda struggled to find the right words. For perhaps the first time in years, confidence abandoned her completely. "I owe you an apology." The nearby conversations disappeared altogether. Sarah remained silent, allowing her to continue. Linda lowered her eyes briefly. "This morning, I judged you before I knew anything about you." Her voice was steady, but the regret behind it was unmistakable. "I assumed things based on appearance. I treated you unfairly, and I embarrassed you in front of others." Several parents listening nearby shifted uncomfortably. Linda continued, "There is no excuse for it." The auditorium seemed unusually still. Sarah looked at her for a moment, then smiled gently. Not the smile of someone enjoying an apology. The smile of someone who understood human mistakes. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. Linda exhaled slowly. "I am deeply sorry." Sarah nodded. "I believe you are." The simple response carried more grace than anyone expected. There was no lecture, no public humiliation, no attempt to reverse the embarrassment. Linda seemed almost surprised. "You are not angry?" Sarah glanced toward the students gathering near the stage. "People make assumptions every day." She looked back at Linda. "What matters is what they do after they realize they were wrong." The words settled over the room like a quiet lesson. Several parents lowered their eyes. Others nodded thoughtfully. In that moment, Many people realized the true reason Sarah commanded respect. It was not her donations. It was not her influence. It was her character. And as Linda stood there absorbing those words, she understood that the greatest lesson taught at Oak Ridge Academy that day had not come from a classroom. It had come from the woman everyone had underestimated. The remainder of the celebration unfolded beneath an atmosphere that felt very different from the one that had existed earlier that morning. The polished auditorium, the reserved seating, the formal speeches, and the prestigious guests were all the same. Yet something had changed inside the people filling the room. The conversations that followed were no longer centered on status, influence, or achievement. They centered on Sarah Mitchell. Not because she was wealthy, not because she funded scholarships, but because she had responded to disrespect with grace. As students continued approaching her throughout the afternoon, stories began emerging that even many school administrators had never heard. One graduate spoke about receiving a scholarship during a difficult year after his father lost his job. Another described becoming the first member of her family to attend college because financial barriers had been removed. A young teacher explained how the foundation had supported educational programs that changed hundreds of lives. Sarah listened quietly to every story. She never interrupted. She never redirected attention toward herself. She simply thanked each person for sharing. Meanwhile, Linda Parker remained thoughtful throughout the event. The apology she had offered was sincere, but the experience had forced her to confront something deeper. She realized that her mistake had not started when she asked Sarah to move seats. It had started the moment she believed appearance could reveal someone's value. That realization stayed with her as she watched students gathering around Sarah. Several members of the school board eventually joined the conversation. One of them smiled and said, "Mrs. Mitchell, after all these years, I think everyone expected someone very different." Soft laughter followed. Sarah smiled. "Different how?" The board member hesitated. "Perhaps more formal. More important." Sarah looked around the room. "Important people rarely look the way we imagine." The answer produced another moment of silence. Nearby parents nodded thoughtfully. Even Principal Robert Henderson smiled at the observation. The celebration eventually moved into its final segment. Awards were presented. Student performances filled the stage. Families applauded proudly as young scholars received recognition for their achievements. Through it all, Sarah remained seated quietly among everyone else. She seemed far more interested in celebrating the students than participating in the attention directed toward her. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall auditorium windows, many attendees found themselves reflecting on the events of the day. Some remembered how quickly they had accepted Linda's assumptions. Others recalled their own judgments when Sarah first entered the building. The discomfort was difficult to ignore, yet it was also valuable, because for many people the lesson had become personal. Near the end of the program, Principal Henderson returned to the podium one final time. He thanked the students, families, faculty members, and guests for attending. Then he paused and looked across the audience. "Education is not only about learning facts," he said. "Sometimes the most important lessons arrive when we least expect them." His eyes briefly met Sarah's. Many people understood exactly what he meant. The auditorium grew quiet once more. Not with embarrassment this time, with reflection. And as the final applause filled the room, it became clear that the greatest impact made that day would not be measured by scholarships, donations, or awards. It would be measured by the way an entire community began looking at people differently. As the celebration came to an end, families slowly began leaving the auditorium. The late afternoon sun cast long golden rays through the tall windows, bathing the room in a warm glow. Students gathered for photographs with teachers. Parents exchanged farewells. Staff members began collecting programs from empty seats. The excitement of the day was fading, but the lessons remained. Sarah Mitchell stood near the front entrance, preparing to leave. The same canvas handbag rested on her shoulder. The same modest cardigan hung neatly over her blouse. Despite everything that had happened, she looked exactly as she had when she first walked through the school doors that morning. Principal Robert Henderson thanked her one final time for attending. Several board members shook her hand. Students continued approaching her with words of appreciation. Sarah greeted every person with the same kindness she had shown throughout the day. Before leaving, she paused beside a display case filled with photographs of former scholarship recipients. For a moment, she simply looked at the faces. Future doctors, teachers, engineers, scientists, young people who had been given an opportunity and used it well. A quiet smile appeared on her face. Nearby, Linda Parker watched from across the hallway. The embarrassment she felt earlier had slowly transformed into something more valuable. Humility. She approached Sarah one final time. "Mrs. Mitchell." Sarah turned and smiled. "Linda." The use of her first name immediately eased some of the tension. Linda looked around the hallway, then back at Sarah. "I want you to know something." Sarah listened quietly. "Today changed me." Sarah remained silent. Linda continued. "I spend so much time evaluating people, applications, interviews, families, students. I convinced myself I was good at understanding people quickly." She paused. "Today taught me how wrong I can be." Sarah nodded gently. "Then today was useful for both of us." Linda laughed softly. "You are being far kinder than I deserve." Sarah shook her head. "Growth begins when people are willing to admit mistakes. Many never reach that point." The words settled comfortably between them. For the first time that day, Linda smiled without discomfort. It was the smile of someone who had learned something important. As Sarah turned toward the exit, a young student hurried across the lobby. It was the same volunteer who had handed out programs that morning. "Mrs. Mitchell," he called. Sarah stopped. The teenager looked slightly nervous. "I just wanted to thank you." Sarah smiled. "For what?" The student glanced toward the scholarship display nearby. "For believing in people you do not even know." For a moment, Sarah seemed genuinely touched. She placed a hand lightly over her heart. "Thank you for saying that." The student smiled and returned to his friends. Sarah then stepped through the front doors and into the cool afternoon air. Behind her, Oak Ridge Academy looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The buildings had not changed. The hallways had not changed. The people, however, had. Parents who once judged appearances now carried a different perspective home with them. Teachers reflected on their assumptions. Students witnessed the power of dignity in action. And Linda Parker would never again look at a stranger and assume she knew their story. Sarah walked toward the parking lot, disappearing into the golden light of the setting sun. She left without seeking recognition, praise, or admiration. She left exactly as she had arrived. Quiet, humble, unassuming. Yet the lesson she left behind would remain long after the applause had faded. Because that day, everyone at Oak Ridge Academy discovered a truth they would never forget. Respect should never depend on knowing someone's title. And that day, the school remembered what dignity truly looks like.